In 1981, a mining company announced over the radio that it was shutting down. Within 6 months, 90% of the town was gone. You can't get insurance on a home there to this day. In the Yukon, a town burned to the ground on Friday the 13th. They rebuilt it. The mine went bankrupt. The cleanup bill is now in the billions. In Quebec, the president of an iron mine shut it down and left. He became prime minister 2 years later. The company demolished the buildings. The indigenous communities who'd been there all along, they stayed. 10 Canadian towns, frozen somewhere around 1975. Houses that cost less than a used truck, and reasons nobody's buying them that go a lot deeper than the price tag. Let's get into it.
Number 1. Faro, Yukon. The town of Faro was named after a card game. A gambling game, specifically, the kind where you bet on the order cards are drawn and hope luck falls your way. That feels less like trivia and more like prophecy. In 1969, the Cypress Anvil Mining Corporation carved a town out of raw boreal forest in central Yukon, 356 kilometers northeast of Whitehorse, to house workers at what would become the largest open-pit lead-zinc mine in the world. They built houses, a school designed for 400 students, a curling rink, a department store, a hotel. They built it for up to 3,000 people. Then, on Friday the 13th of June, and you cannot invent this, a lightning-sparked forest fire burned the entire new town site to the ground. They rebuilt. The mine opened, and for a decade, Faro was Yukon's second largest community, generating over a third of the territory's entire GDP. The mine first closed in 1982, reopened under new owners, closed again, reopened again. Finally, in 1998, the last operator went bankrupt and walked away, leaving behind 320 million tons of toxic waste rock and one of the most contaminated abandoned mine sites in Canada. More than $700 million has already been spent just on care and maintenance before full remediation has even started, and total projected costs are now estimated in the billions. The mine spans 25 square kilometers. That's roughly the size of Victoria, BC. The population bottomed out at 97 during a temporary shutdown in 1985. The 2016 census counted 348. The 2021 census recorded 440, a 26% jump that suggests a slow but real recovery. The school, built for 400 students, now enrolls about 50. The town still has 3 fire trucks, sized for the infrastructure, not the population. Now, nobody mentions this part. Faro has experienced something of a quiet resurgence. Abandoned homes have been bought up. There's actually a housing shortage. Lots have been selling in the $28,000 to $30,000 range, and the town has started selling new building lots. But the infrastructure underneath all of this, water, sewer, roads, was engineered for a community 7 times its current size, and it's being maintained on a tax base of fewer than 500 people. Faro is beautiful. The Pelly River Valley is stunning. Dall sheep graze on the mountains above town, but this is a place that has burned down, boomed, busted, boomed again, busted, and somehow kept going. The locals call it a serial community, always reforming, never quite the same twice. Whether that's resilience or stubbornness depends on how the next hand is dealt.
Number 2. Flin Flon, Manitoba. Here's something absurd. Flin Flon is named after a character in a 1905 pulp novel called The Sunless City. The character's full name is Josiah Flintabaddy Flanaton. A prospector found a copy of the book at an abandoned campsite and named the area after it. That feels appropriate because Flin Flon in the 21st century has the energy of fiction nobody quite believes anymore. This is a mining city that sits directly on the Manitoba-Saskatchewan border, literally governed by both provinces. Population peaked around 10,000 in the 1970s. The 2016 census counted 5,185 across both sides. Recent estimates hover near 4,940 on the Manitoba portion alone, with the average age creeping past 42. The economy here was built on one thing, the Hudson Bay and Smelting Company, now absorbed into Hudbay Minerals. When the mine's future became uncertain, the town's future became uncertain with it. Before you call your agent, know this. Flin Flon is over 600 kilometers northwest of Winnipeg. The food bank now serves more than 400 households, double what it handled a decade ago. There is no overnight shelter. Housing costs are low, median shelter costs around $760 monthly for homeowners, but the infrastructure gap is real. About 1 in 5 homes was built before 1945. Another 37% went up between 1946 and 1960. That housing stock wasn't designed to last a century, and it hasn't been renovated like it needs to be. The town still functions as a service hub for roughly 20,000 people across the border region, but the structural problem is fundamental. When a single industry town loses its industry, it doesn't decline gracefully, it fragments. Services leave, young people leave, and what's left is a community running on resilience, and not much else.
Number 3. Kapuskasing, Ontario. The catch with Kapuskasing is that it was designed for nearly twice the people who live there. This planned community in northern Ontario was built in the 1920s by Kimberly Clark to house workers for their Spruce Falls pulp and paper mill. They laid out streets, built a civic center, constructed a hospital, all engineered for a population of 14,000. By the last census, Kapuskasing had dropped to about 8,600. That gap between what the town was built for and who actually lives there defines everything about the place. The good news is that this means housing was absurdly cheap for years. Homes that would cost $600,000 in southern Ontario sat on the market for under $100,000. The infrastructure existed. The schools existed. The roads were paved and plowed. You just had to be willing to live somewhere that winter starts in October and doesn't let go until May, where the nearest city of any real size is Timmins, about 200 kilometers southeast, and where your career options revolve around the mill, the mines, or the long commute to the Detour Gold operation northeast of Cochrane. Consider this. COVID actually helped Kapuskasing. Remote workers discovered they could buy a house with a river view for what they'd spend on first and last month's rent in Toronto. The housing surplus evaporated. Prices started climbing. International students arrived at the Université de Hearst's local campus. The mayor started talking about needing to build new housing for the first time in decades. But let's be honest about what hasn't changed. The pulp and paper industry is contracting globally. Newsprint demand falls every year. The mill still operates, but every Northern Ontario resident who depends on a paper mill knows the arithmetic is working against them. This town's revival is real, but it's fragile, and it's running on a clock that nobody can predict.
Number 4. Tumbler Ridge, British Columbia. In Vancouver, a one-bedroom condo averages north of $700,000. In Tumbler Ridge, that money would buy you 3 houses and a truck to drive between them. Tumbler Ridge was purpose-built in 1981 to service 2 coal mines. The provincial government designed it from the ground up, a fully planned community deep in northeastern BC, surrounded by the Rocky Mountain foothills. For a while, it worked beautifully. Population surged past 4,500. Services were solid. The town had a recreation center, schools, everything a young family needed. Then, global coal prices collapsed in the early 2000s. Both mines shut down. By 2001, the population had cratered. Houses that cost $140,000 during the boom were listed for $10,000. Some sold for less. Tumbler Ridge became the Canadian poster child for what happens when a resource town loses its resource.
Meanwhile, something interesting happened. The mines eventually reopened. Population climbed back, a 20% increase between 2016 and 2021. By 2024, the average single-family home crossed $200,000 for the first time in more than a decade. What the photos don't show is the underlying structure. 71% of homes were built between 1981 and 1990. That's a narrow construction window for an entire town. These houses are all aging at the same rate, built with the same materials, and most haven't seen significant renovation. Only 7% of the housing stock has been built in the last quarter century. The governance issue here is dependency. Tumbler Ridge has recovered before, and it could crash again tomorrow if coal markets shift. The town is about 120 kilometers south of Chetwynd and roughly 400 kilometers from Prince George. If the mines close again, there is no Plan B commute. There's no backup employer within driving distance. Worth noting, the area is genuinely stunning. Dinosaur fossils, waterfalls, mountain scenery that rivals anything in BC. If the mines hold, this town has a shot. If they don't, we've already seen this movie.
Number 5. Smooth Rock Falls, Ontario. Population in 2021, 1,200. Population at its peak, more than double that. The town has lost nearly 46% of its people since 1986 alone. Smooth Rock Falls, roughly 65 kilometers east of Kapuskasing on Highway 11, is what happens when you remove the single employer from a community that was built around exactly one thing. The Tembec pulp mill, later acquired by Rayonier, was the town's economic spine. When that operation curtailed, Smooth Rock Falls didn't just shrink, it hollowed. Homes here are among the cheapest in the entire province. You can find listings under $50,000 for a full house. Commercial properties sit vacant. The downtown feels like a museum exhibit of 1975, except nobody curated it that way. It just stopped being updated. The infrastructure gap is staggering for a town this small. Roads, water systems, and municipal buildings were all designed and built for a population that no longer exists. The tax base that maintained them has fractured. Services that Southern Ontarians take for granted, a nearby walk-in clinic, a grocery store with fresh produce year-round, reliable high-speed internet, are either limited or absent entirely. One problem that nobody in Queen's Park likes to discuss: unincorporated and small municipalities across Northern Ontario are structurally incapable of funding their own infrastructure renewal. The federal and provincial transfer systems were designed for growing communities. Shrinking ones don't fit the funding model. So the pipes age, the roads crack, and the property taxes can't cover the gap. Smooth Rock Falls is not a place where you move for convenience. It's a place where you move because you've decided convenience is overrated and silence is undervalued.
Number 6. Iroquois Falls, Ontario. Iroquois Falls was once called the town that Abitibi built, and that's not local folklore, it's the literal history. In 1912, the Abitibi Power and Paper Company established a mill on the Abitibi River. The company then built the entire town around it. Houses, schools, a hospital, recreation facilities, all company-funded, all designed to attract and retain workers in a location that is, to put it charitably, profoundly remote. For decades, it worked. The mill churned out newsprint, families raised kids, the hockey arena produced players who went on to the NHL. Iroquois Falls, at its height, was a thriving community. The town was designed and built for a much larger population than it holds today, and based on available census data, it appears to have peaked around 4,700 to 5,000 before beginning its slow decline. It had the infrastructure, the services, and the community bonds that come with a place where everyone works for the same employer and knows it. Then the paper industry began its long, irreversible contraction. Newsprint demand peaked and fell, mill operations were reduced, and the mill eventually closed permanently in 2014. The population dropped to around 4,400 by 2021. Here's where it gets interesting. The homes in Iroquois Falls are solidly built. Company towns had standards, and they remain remarkably affordable. Three-bedroom houses regularly list under $100,000, some under $60,000. The bones are good, but the systems are 50 years old. Furnaces, wiring, plumbing, all original in many cases. The reality check is distance. Iroquois Falls is roughly 70 kilometers from Timmins and about 750 kilometers from Toronto. The nearest major hospital is in Timmins. Winter doesn't play around this far north. Expect sustained temperatures below -30 and snowfall measured in meters, not centimeters. But the river is beautiful. The forests are vast, and there's a particular kind of person who reads all of that and thinks, perfect.
Number 7. Bathurst, New Brunswick. Bathurst sits on the Bay of Chaleur in northeastern New Brunswick, and it may be the most visually beautiful town on this entire list. The bay catches light in a way that makes the whole coastline look like it was painted by someone who understood color theory. Sunsets here are genuinely absurd. Population? Roughly 12,000 in the wider area, though the trajectory has been downward for decades. The median age is high. The economy once rested on the Brunswick mining and smelting operation, one of the world's largest underground zinc mines. It closed in 2013. Before that, base metal mining defined this region for over half a century. The town's center has the kind of architecture you don't see anymore. Brick storefronts, wide sidewalks, churches that actually look like churches. The residential streets are lined with older homes, many of them wood frame construction from the 1950s through the 1970s. Housing is startlingly affordable by national standards. The home ownership rate sits at about 94%, one of the highest anywhere in Canada. The federal government allocated $3 million through the Housing Accelerator Fund to help build new units, which tells you that even in a declining market, the housing stock needed refreshing. Downside? The job market is thin. Mining is gone. Fishing and forestry remain, but neither is what it was. Bilingualism is an asset here. The region is heavily francophone, but it can also be a barrier for unilingual English speakers trying to integrate. What the listing doesn't tell you is that Bathurst's winters, while milder than Northern Ontario's, still carry serious weight. Coastal wind off the bay turns -15 into something that feels much worse. And the distance from any major urban center, Moncton is nearly 3 hours south, means you're committing fully to this place if you move here.
Number 8. Uranium City, Saskatchewan. In December 1981, El Dorado Nuclear announced it was closing its Beaver Lodge mine in northern Saskatchewan. According to one longtime resident, the news came over CBC radio. There was no town meeting, no transition plan, just a broadcast and an entire community's economy evaporating in a single sentence. People who were mid-flight, literally on planes moving to Uranium City for new jobs, landed in a town that no longer had any. Uranium City was built in the early 1950s as a model mining community on the northern shore of Lake Athabasca, about 760 kilometers northwest of Prince Albert and 50 kilometers from the Northwest Territories border. The provincial government modeled it after Arvida, Quebec, with infrastructure planned for 5,000. At its height, the broader region supported close to 10,000 people across a dozen mines. The town itself had around 2,500 residents on the eve of the closure announcement, though some accounts place the peak closer to 3,500 in earlier years. There was a high school, named Candu after the nuclear reactor, with 300 students, 2 gymnasiums and woodworking shops. There were businesses, churches, a hotel, an arena. Within 6 months, the vast majority of the population was gone. The Encyclopedia of Saskatchewan records the drop from roughly 2,500 to 200 by 1986. Some flew out, many left by the winter ice road that crosses Lake Athabasca, open only for a few weeks each year when the ice is thick enough to bear vehicles. Residents recall that housing values collapsed to zero almost overnight and that insurance companies stopped covering homes entirely. The Uranium City Act was repealed on October 1, 1983, stripping the community of its municipal status and reducing it to an unincorporated northern settlement. The hospital hung on until 2003, then closed.
The 2021 census counted 91 residents. Here's what the official record won't capture. A longtime resident described the day of the announcement as the day kids in school started crying and adults didn't know how to stop them. 40 years later, he still calls the empty lots by the names of the families who once lived there. There is no all-season road to Uranium City. In winter, there's an ice road from Fond du Lac. Otherwise, you fly. Homes have no conventional market value, you can't get a mortgage, and you can't get insurance. The school that remains serves kindergarten through grade 9 with roughly 10 students enrolled. This is arguably the most dramatic single-industry collapse in Canadian history. Not the slowest, that distinction belongs to dozens of towns bleeding out over decades, but the fastest, the most complete. A functioning community of thousands reduced to fewer than 100, with no road out and no plan to rebuild. And yet, people stay. A few dozen souls who refuse to leave the place they call home in a town the rest of Canada forgot exists the moment the uranium stopped flowing.
Number 9. Schefferville, Quebec. Schefferville doesn't appear on most people's mental map of Canada. That's partly because you can't drive there. There is no road. You arrive by plane through Schefferville Airport, or you take the train, a 12-hour journey from Sept Îles through boreal forest and subarctic plateau aboard the Chiwetin Rail Transportation, which holds the distinction of being the first railway in Canada fully owned and operated by First Nations. The Naskapi, the Innu of Matimakush Lac John, and the Innu of Uashat Makmani Utanam acquired the line after mining companies tried to abandon it along with everything else. The Iron Ore Company of Canada built Schefferville in the mid-1950s to support massive open-pit iron mining. At its peak in the late 1960s, the town had nearly 5,000 residents, a movie theater, a hospital, a Hudson's Bay department store. The company ran the town. The company was the town. Then, on November 2, 1982, the IOC, led by its president, Brian Mulroney, who would win the Conservative leadership the following year and become Prime Minister in 1984, announced the mine was closing. Within months, roughly 4,000 non-Indigenous residents left. The company dismantled much of what it had built, leaving vacant lots where buildings once stood. According to a 1986 Montreal Gazette report, Quebec's government at one point raised the possibility of simply bulldozing what remained. The town didn't die, but it transformed into something completely different from what was originally built. Today, Schefferville's municipal population sits around 155 to 259, depending on the count. The broader community is predominantly Indigenous, the Innu of Matimakush Lac John and the Naskapi of nearby Kawawachakamache, each numbering around 1,000 residents. These are the people who kept Schefferville alive. They were here before the mine, were displaced and marginalized during the boom years, and remained after everyone else left. Homes in the municipality hold almost no conventional market value. The mean annual temperature is minus 5.3 degrees Celsius. Permafrost underlies much of the area. The legacy of decades of open-pit mining includes more than 24 abandoned pits, eroding waste rock piles, and contaminated water that the Innu have described as red water seeping across their traditional territory. According to academic researchers who have studied the region, a lawsuit valued at approximately $900 million was filed against the former operator on behalf of the Innu, and as of the most recent reports, it remained unresolved. Some mining has returned. Tata Steel began operations in the area in 2011, mostly using fly-in workers rather than rebuilding the town's population. New mineral exploration continues. But this isn't really a story about cheap real estate. It's a story about what happens when a company builds a town on Indigenous land, extracts what it wants, and leaves the original inhabitants to manage the wreckage. The Innu and Naskapi didn't inherit Schefferville. They reclaimed it. And that distinction matters more than any listing price ever could.
Number 10. Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. Halifax, 300 kilometers to the southwest, is booming. Property values climbing, restaurants opening, tech companies expanding.
Nova Scotia's capital is having a moment. Cape Breton Regional Municipality is having the opposite of a moment. It's been having the opposite of a moment for 60 years. This was once the industrial heart of Atlantic Canada. Coal and steel built Sydney, Glace Bay, New Waterford, and the surrounding communities into a network of working-class towns that punched well above their weight. At its peak, the CBRM area was home to well over 100,000 people. The steel plant and the coal mines employed thousands. The steel plant closed in 2001. The coal mines had been winding down for decades before that. Since 1961, Cape Breton has lost roughly 30% of its population. The young leave, the old stay. The cycle repeats. Then there's this one wrinkle. Cape Breton is spectacularly beautiful. The Cabot Trail is one of the most celebrated drives in North America. The Celtic music scene is world-renowned. The coastline alternates between dramatic cliffs and sheltered harbors that look like they were designed by someone with a tourism degree. Housing remains among the cheapest in the country. You can find homes and communities outside Sydney for well under $100,000, some for under $50,000. The bones are often sound. Cape Breton tradespeople built to last, but the roofs, furnaces, and windows need updating in most cases. The structural reality hasn't changed, though. The CBRM has been wrestling with decline for 6 decades. Right-sizing services, consolidating infrastructure, attracting newcomers, the political will exists, but the economics remain brutal. The tax base continues to erode. Federal transfers help, but they don't rebuild an economy. Worth noting, the pandemic brought a wave of remote workers and dreamers who saw cheap coastal property and made the leap. Nova Scotia briefly hit a population milestone of 1 million. Some of those newcomers stayed, some didn't. Cape Breton's long-term trajectory depends on whether the next wave is bigger than the last one and whether they stay through the second winter.
10 towns. 10 places where the clock slowed down, where the houses are cheap and the streets are quiet, and where the reasons for both of those things are the same. Every one of these communities was built on a single industry: lead zinc, uranium, newsprint, coal, iron ore, zinc, steel. When that industry left, the towns didn't die, they diminished, slowly, steadily, over decades that most of Canada chose not to watch. And in some cases, Uranium City, Schefferville, not slowly at all, overnight. What we've seen today isn't just a collection of cheap real estate listings. It's a structural story about how Canada builds towns for extraction and then walks away when the resource runs out. The infrastructure stays, the people leave, and the communities that remain are left to fund roads and pipes and hospitals with tax bases that shrink a little more every year. In Schefferville's case, it was Indigenous communities who stayed to pick up the pieces on their own land. The question worth asking isn't, would you buy a $60,000 house in Northern Ontario? The question is, should a country as wealthy as Canada have communities aging into collapse because the funding models only work when populations grow? Over 20% of Canadian cities lost population between 2011 and 2016. The majority of the country's civil infrastructure is more than 50 years old, and yet the policy conversation is almost entirely about growth, how to build more, attract more, expand more. Nobody is writing the playbook for what happens when a town gets smaller. These 10 places deserve better than nostalgia. They deserve an honest conversation about what it means to sustain a community when the economic engine that built it is gone. Would you live in one of these towns? And more importantly, should the government be doing more to keep them alive? Tell me in the comments. If this is the kind of content that makes you think differently about Canada, subscribe. We're building something here. Not a cheap listings channel, but a place where the real Canada gets the analysis it deserves. I'll see you in the next one.